Susan, classically, we've all been raised on the so-called mind-body problem. What's the relationship between the body, everything we physically, and the mind? Now we say with the brain-mind problem. How do you begin to look at the two entities, the brain and the mind, and ask that fundamental question?
Well, I think this is a really important distinction because in the past, as you know, people had this dualistic approach that the mind was the province of the philosophers that dealt with all the exotic and romantic and rarefied human emotions, and people like me and you dealt with the squalor of the chemistry of the brain, and no one bought you a drink at parties or anything because you were just a nerd and weren't trafficking at all in the higher human emotions and everything that makes you special and so on. So let's think about how, because we use the two separate words, so clearly there must be different contexts in which they are. They must be different in some way. My own view is that you can think about the mind in neuroscientific terms and in a way that is distinct from generic brain terms. And this is what I think. As you'll know, when you're born with a fair complement of brain cells, but it's the growth of the connections between your brain cells that accounts for the growth of the brain after birth. And this enables human beings especially to have a particular talent that other species have, but we have it superlatively. And it's why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet. It's not that we're strong, we don't run fast, we don't see well. What do we do that means we're so successful? Is we learn, we adapt. Now, I say other species do this, of course, to greater or lesser extents. Goldfish, not very much, say, but they don't have great personalities. Cats and dogs, a bit. Yes, they do have personalities. Human beings, particularly, highly individual creatures, so that it's an astonishing thought that no one has a mind like yours for the 100,000 years that we've been around as a species. So what is the basis for this? This personalization of the brain, my own view, is through the personalization, the shaping of the brain connections postnatally that will reflect your individual experiences. Even if you're a clone, that's to say an identical twin, you're going to have a unique configuration of brain cell connections. And as you'll know, this is called plasticity, and it's a very well-known phenomenon now and a very much researched area now. There's just one, perhaps two very quick examples, if you're not familiar with these. One is of the London cab drivers. London cab drivers, unlike any other cab drivers in the world, to my experience at least, have to pass this ominous test called the knowledge, where they have to remember all the streets of London without recourse to a manual. So they have a huge burden on their working memory. And it's been shown in brain scans of London taxi drivers that an area of the brain related to memory, as it happens, it's called the hippocampus, is bigger in London taxi drivers because you use it or you lose it. Just like you exercise muscle, what is very exciting is the brain will change palpably and clearly and experimentally visible with experiences. Another very exciting experiment involved piano players, where 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano, were taught 5-finger piano exercises for about 5 days. The controls just stared at a piano. There was no change in their brains. The guys that learnt the exercises, clear changes in their brains. But the most exciting were a 3rd group who'd been asked merely to imagine they were playing the piano. And those ones had changes in their brain scans almost identical to the people who'd physically played it. Now, I think this is a clue, because clearly the important thing for the change there in the brain had been the thinking, not the physical contraction of the muscle. And the man who developed the treatment for Parkinson's disease, a man called Warnakowicz in the 1960s, came up with a brilliant quote. He said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain." Thinking is, and that's what this experiment shows, that the mere thought is actually changing the brain cell connections.
One very practical thing that people use in sports is to image and imagine yourself playing. I've been trying in my old age to learn ping pong very seriously. And what I do before I go to bed is I imagine the strokes over and over
and it helps.
again.
I've heard this.
And it really does help. I mean, sometimes I can go physically without playing for weeks, but I've done that in my mind. When I come back, I've
So you're
improved.
rehearsing. So this tells you that you can't separate mental from physical. I mean, I've incidentally tried imagining I'm a millionaire, but that hasn't worked yet. So clearly you have the limitations. Now, we know from experiments on creatures that can learn, because humans won't obviously volunteer for these experiments when you want to look at the brain cells, such as rats, that the basis for this is if you make your brain cells work hard, if they're more active over a long period of time, rather like muscles, yes, they will grow. They'll get stronger and more efficient. But the way they grow is to grow branches. And why is that interesting or important? Well, by growing more branches, what happens is you're increasing the surface area of your brain cell, freeing it up, therefore, to be an easier target for more and more brain connections. So just to recap, a stimulating interactive environment, whether it's piano playing or taxi driving, whatever it is, ping pong even, thinking, makes your brain cells work hard. They will respond when they're active, when they're working hard by growing branches. Those branches make it easier for them to make connections. Now think about what that means. You're starting in life, in the words of the great psychologist, William James, in a booming, buzzing confusion. And you'll evaluate the world, because you have no choice, in raw senses. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. But gradually, as the weeks turn to months, an erstwhile abstract visual pattern accompanied by meaningless sounds and colours, if it presents again and again and again, the brain cells will accommodate that in your brain and no one else's. And slowly you'll shift from a sensory to what we call a cognitive take on the world. It'll be your mum. And if mum, as we hope, features again and again and again in your life, more and more connections will form, subconscious, possibly associations, but nonetheless, mum will now mean something to you. She will have a significance that she won't to someone else, who will see her as some generic lady. So this is how you personalize your brain. And then as you get older, slowly it becomes a two-way street. So now you'll evaluate any event or personal object in terms of your prior experiences and what they mean to you, not just in pure sensory terms. And that ongoing experience will upgrade and update the existing connections. So you're in this constant dialogue. And for me, this is the mind. The mind, I would argue, is the personalization of your neuronal connectivity, driven in turn by your unique experiences in life.
Okay, that's very good. But just connect the dots for me for a moment, from the increasing number of connections to the capacity to have this personalization. How specifically does that happen?
I think it would happen. Well, obviously, we can't study it in people at the level of looking at neuronal connectivity, but the ability to see one thing in terms of something else, to make a connection, enables you to understand it. Let me give you another example that doesn't reflect well on me, I have to say, as a babysitter, but nonetheless. I have a brother who's 13 years younger than me, and when I was 16 or so, and he was 3, I used to go in for all forms of torture because I hated him. And one of the forms of tortures was to force him to learn Shakespeare. I thought this was very funny, which, being a little parrot of 3 years old, he could do. And there is a very, very famous soliloquy in Shakespeare where it's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace. And someone said that must have gone down a storm in playgroup, having a 3-year-old coming in and saying that. But anyway, it goes on. Out, brief candle, life is but a poor player. Now, had you said to him, Graham, what does it mean? Do you understand that line that you've just said, out, brief candle? He might have said, yes, I have a candle on my birthday cake, and I blow it out. He couldn't have seen it in terms of death. And of course, that's the power of the thing. It's a metaphor for the extinction of life. So as you get older, as you make more associations, you can understand something by seeing one thing in terms of something else. Let's take another example.
And can you make the connection between the connections we see in the mental world and those connections of individual neurons? How do you do that?
Well, until someone comes up, and I think there's a fortune to be made if anyone out there wants to make a fortune, with brain imaging techniques, not so much to concentrate on having very fast images of the brain, but more if you could think of a spatially refined, much higher spatial resolution where you could put some kind of helmet on someone and see their...
Right.
Yes, I think that's for the future. Right. But until you can do that, then no, because you can only look at the brain cell connections forming post-mortem, which most people won't be cheerful about volunteering to do. So you can't see that, but it makes every sense that this is how we can understand the world. So, for example, take something like a wedding ring, which a small baby might be attracted to because it's gold and shiny by virtue of its sensory properties. Gradually, you'll learn that rings are things you put on fingers. Then you'll learn that wedding rings are different from other rings. Then you might have a wedding ring of your own. And that generically looking ordinary gold band will mean something to you that other wedding rings do not. And as you go from, let's say, the honeymoon through to divorce, your attitudes might change. So this thing might be the most important thing in your life, even though it's a generic looking kind of gold object. Now, what's very interesting with this interpretation of mind as being this ability to personalize the brain and the growth of connections, of course, it fits perfectly with notions of blowing the mind and losing the mind. So let's think first of dementia, literally a loss of mind, as in Alzheimer's disease. What we know is that there is an atrophy of the connections, an atrophy of the branches. So the person, and sadly we know this is what happens, will recapitulate childhood. They'll go back into a world where, again, things don't make sense. You're confused and disorientated. If you showed a small child a ghost, someone dressed up as a ghost, they'd be frightened, as would an Alzheimer patient, because they lack the checks and balances of the adult mind that enables you to see one thing in terms of something else. It enables you to understand it, to look beyond the face value of the object or the stimulus or whatever's coming in. So we know that with dementia, the reason and the way we can interpret the recapitulation of childhood is through the atrophy of those associations or connections. Similarly, blowing the mind, losing the mind, something fascinates me hugely. If you think about wine, women and song, incarnated nowadays as drugs, sex and rock and roll, what do they all have in common? They have an abrogation of the sense of self. You let yourself go, you blow your mind, you're out of your mind. Sensation. If I said to you, Robert, let's go out now and have a really good old cognitive time, you wouldn't want to come. But if I said, let's go out and have a sensational time, yes. Yeah. And this goes back, ever since we've stalked the planet, into this idea that you can let yourself go. You're just a passive, sensational being, receiving just raw sensations. The way you do that is if you take drugs or alcohol, it's because it impairs the neuronal connections, or you put yourself in an environment stripped of all cognitive content, techno, those discos or whatever they're called nowadays, raves that people go to, where you're putting yourself where there's a premium on raw senses. So I think we can think about the things that we pay money to do, actually, as notions of blowing the mind, losing the mind, again, temporarily disabling those connections. So ideas like dementia and blowing the mind stand up and are consistent with this notion of the mind as something that is based on your personalized neuronal connectivity. It's not generic, it's personalized, but it is physical and it is part of the brain.